when a smug judge fined Keanu Reeves, thinking he was just another clueless celebrity. The courtroom laughed. But minutes later, silence fell, because Keanu revealed something no one expected, and the judge's world came crashing down. What happened next changed everything. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Keanu Reeves wasn't expected to be here today. Not in this place, not at this hour, not in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood polish and harsh judgment. But here he was, walking quietly into the modest chambers of the Westgate Municipal Courthouse. No cameras followed him, no fans screaming his name. He wasn't the movie star today. He wasn't the action hero the world adored. Today, Keanu was just a man standing up for something he believed in. The courtroom was nothing special. Pale beige walls, fluorescent lighting, worn wooden benches filled with locals waiting their turn to be heard. It was a room where petty disputes were settled, where small fines were levied, where names and stories blurred together in the endless procession of cases. But this case wasn't petty to Keanu. It was personal. The dispute was over a small plot of land, barely a sliver on the edge of town, but to Keanu, it was everything. That land was home to the Hope Haven Youth Shelter, a place where kids with nowhere else to go found refuge. He'd funded it quietly for years, never putting his name on the sign, never calling attention to his involvement. It was one of the things he did because he believed in second chances, because someone had once given him his. But now, that land was under threat. A real estate development firm with deep pockets and sharp lawyers was trying to void the lease and claim the property. They wanted to build another luxury condo complex, something shiny and profitable, and they had managed to convince the local authorities to question the legality of the shelter's lease. Keanu was here to set things straight. He wore a simple black suit, not tailored designer fashion, but neat, respectful, and clean. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes polished. His dark hair, slightly longer than usual, was tucked neatly behind his ears. There was no entourage, no lawyers speaking on his behalf. Just him, a man determined to defend what was right. As Keanu stepped inside, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Some recognized him immediately. Others squinted, unsure if it was really him. A few whispered to each other, pointing discreetly. But most eyes quickly shifted toward the elevated bench at the front of the room. That's where Judge Arthur Calloway sat. Judge Calloway had a reputation, arrogant, cold. His sentences were famously harsh, and his courtroom ran like a tight ship, his ship. He was a man who brooked no delays, no excuses, and no displays of celebrity privilege. Over his 30 years on the bench, he had built an image of absolute control, and today he was determined not to be swayed by the presence of a movie star. As Keanu approached the table where he'd present his case, Judge Calloway's sharp gaze followed him. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers drumming impatiently on the polished wood of his desk. Then he smirked. "Well, well," Calloway drawled, his voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. "Didn't expect to see John Wick needing legal help today." There was an uncomfortable chuckle from one corner of the room, but Keanu didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't return the jab. Instead, he placed his leather folder neatly on the desk before him and opened it, revealing carefully organized documents, releases, contracts, bank statements, photographs, evidence, truth. He adjusted his cufflinks slowly, methodically, then rested his hands on the table, calm, composed, ready. "I'm here regarding the lease for Hope Haven Youth Shelter," Keanu said, his voice steady but low. It wasn't the booming voice of an action hero. It was quiet, almost gentle, but it commanded attention. "This shelter provides a safe place for at-risk youth. The land lease is valid, and I'm prepared to present documentation to support that." Judge Calloway lifted an eyebrow, unimpressed. He glanced down at the file before him, flipping it open lazily. His lips curled slightly in what might have been amusement or disdain. "Mr. Reeves, you do understand this is a court of law, not a movie set," he said. "We deal in facts here, not dramatic monologues." Another faint ripple of laughter fluttered through the spectators. Keanu stayed silent. He wasn't here to entertain anyone. He wasn't here to argue. He was here for the kids who needed that shelter, for the staff who worked tirelessly to give those kids a shot at life, for the promise he had made to himself a long time ago that if he ever found himself in a position to help, he would. He looked at Judge Calloway then, not with anger, not with defiance, but with calm, unwavering resolve. And that's when something shifted in the room. People noticed it. The silence became heavier. Even the judge seemed to sense it, pausing briefly as if trying to figure out what was happening. Keanu carefully slid the first document toward the clerk, who picked it up and brought it to the judge's bench. It was a certified copy of the lease agreement. Ironclad, signed, notarized, and well within legal bounds. Judge Calloway barely glanced at it before setting it aside. "I'll be the judge of that," he muttered, reaching for his gavel. "Let's proceed." What started as a routine hearing was about to become anything but. The courtroom was still, except for the faint scratching of pens and the occasional shuffle of paper. Keanu Reeves sat at the small wooden table, his fingers resting lightly against a file of documents he had spent days assembling. His expression was composed, his shoulders relaxed. But beneath the stillness was a quiet strength, one born of years learning to stand with integrity when things became difficult. Judge Arthur Calloway leaned forward on the bench, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. His eyes, sharp and calculating, settled on Keanu like a hawk circling its prey. The judge had presided over this courtroom for decades, and his disdain for celebrity and privilege was well documented. Today, he saw an opportunity to assert his control, and Keanu Reeves, whether he realized it or not, was now his target. "Mr. Reeves," Calloway said, his voice cutting through the air like a cold wind, "you may proceed." Keanu nodded once, rising to his feet. He slid one document from the folder and handed it to the court clerk with practiced efficiency. His movements were careful, deliberate. There was nothing showy about them, no performance, just precision. As the clerk delivered the document to the judge, Keanu spoke, his voice steady. "Your Honor, the lease agreement between the Hope Haven Youth Shelter and Westgate Properties was signed in good faith. It's a 15-year term, fully notarized and approved by the Zoning Commission. The shelter has complied with every regulation. There have been no breaches of contract, no violations of code. The claim that the shelter is unlawfully occupying the property is, respectfully, without merit." For a moment there was silence. A few heads in the gallery nodded subtly. Some spectators, familiar with the shelter and its impact on the community, sat forward on their benches, hopeful. Calloway flipped through the papers with feigned interest. "And this information you're sharing today, Mr. Reeves," he said slowly, his tone dripping with skepticism, "is coming from where? Your experience as an attorney?" The sarcasm was thick. Keanu didn't flinch. "It's coming from my role as the primary benefactor and representative for the shelter, Your Honor. I've worked closely with legal counsel to understand the lease terms." Calloway snorted softly. "Hollywood spin," he muttered, though not softly enough to avoid the courtroom microphones. "Actors playing lawyers in court now." There was a low murmur through the gallery, people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Keanu kept his composure. His hands rested calmly at his sides. His eyes stayed on the judge, unwavering but respectful. "Your Honor," Keanu continued, keeping his tone level, "the lease agreement is legally binding. Page 12 outlines the conditions of use, and the shelter has adhered to them." Calloway sighed loudly, as though bored with the entire exercise. "Mr. Reeves," he interrupted sharply, "you are not a lawyer. You are not here to argue the law. You're here as a witness. Stick to your role." Keanu nodded once, choosing not to contest the warning. He returned to his seat, slowly, placing his papers neatly on the table in front of him. He made no show of frustration, but his jaw set slightly. A small, almost imperceptible shift. The proceedings dragged on for another 10 minutes. Calloway made a point of interrupting Keanu's statements, cutting off explanations, and turning to the development firm's lawyer with unnecessary praise for clarity and decorum. It became clear quickly to everyone in the room that Judge Calloway had no interest in impartiality. Then it happened. Keanu had stood once more to clarify a legal term referenced by the opposing counsel, an innocuous request for the court to specify whether the term reversionary interest applied in this case. It was a reasonable question, one that any responsible party would ask, but Calloway's reaction was swift and severe. "That's enough," Judge Calloway barked, his gavel slamming down hard on the bench. The sharp crack made several people jump. "This court will not tolerate disruptions." Keanu blinked once but remained calm. "Your Honor, I said enough," Calloway roared. His face was flushed now, a deep red climbing up from his collar. "This is not a classroom, Mr. Reeves. You do not get to play student and teacher in my courtroom. I warned you once." Keanu stood silent. "For disrupting court decorum," Calloway declared, glaring over his glasses, "I am imposing a fine, $1,000, effective immediately." The room fell into stunned silence. It was an excessive penalty, everyone knew it. A procedural delay, asking for clarity, it wasn't even grounds for a warning in most courtrooms. But Judge Calloway's mind was made up. His decision was final. Keanu inhaled deeply through his nose, then exhaled slowly. He gave no protest. He made no visible reaction. His hand moved only to reach for a pen, which he used to jot a note in the margin of his papers. One quiet sentence. Then he capped the pen and folded his hands again. But something shifted. Observers in the room noticed it. It was subtle, a quiet change in posture, in demeanor. Keanu was no longer the polite participant hoping for fairness. He had become something else. His gaze turned sharper, more analytical. He was watching now, listening in a different way, not for his own defense, but for something deeper. Calloway didn't notice. He was already moving on, barking orders at clerks, praising the polished presentation of the opposing counsel. But Keanu saw the pattern, the bias, the contempt disguised as law. He began writing again, small notes in tidy handwriting, not for show, not for record, for strategy. Across the room, the young defense attorney, representing Hope Haven, shifted nervously in her chair. She had watched judges abuse power before, but never quite so openly, and never against someone like Keanu Reeves. She whispered under her breath, "This is wrong," and Keanu's glance flickered toward her, as if to agree. But he said nothing. The fine was paid immediately. Keanu wrote a check and handed it to the clerk, thanking her politely as she took it, her hands trembling slightly from the weight of what had just happened. And then Keanu sat back down, calm, collected, waiting. It was then that people in the gallery realized his silence was not submission, it was strategy. He wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The gavel's sharp crack still echoed faintly in the room when Keanu Reeves sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Judge Arthur Calloway straightened his robe with self-satisfaction, ready to move on. The courtroom stirred in hushed murmurs, some in disbelief, others in growing curiosity. Few had expected this. Fewer still understood what was about to unfold. Keanu slowly, quietly, reached for the thick black binder resting at his side. Its cover was plain, worn from use. No logo, no label. Just a single sheet tucked under the clear front, Hope Haven Lease Dispute, reference file. He set it gently on the table. Then, with deliberate care, he opened it. "Your Honor," Keanu said, his voice smooth, respectful, and unwavering. "If I may seek clarification on your ruling." Calloway paused, eyes narrowing. "Clarification?" he echoed with a note of condescension. "I believe I was clear." Keanu didn't rise from his seat. Instead, he calmly flipped through several pages in his binder. "Respectfully, Your Honor," he continued, "there appears to be a misapplication of municipal code. If we are to ensure an accurate and fair proceeding, clarity would benefit all parties." A few quiet murmurs passed through the gallery once more. Even the opposing counsel tilted his head, curious despite himself. Calloway chuckled, shaking his head. "Mr. Reeves," he said with mock patience, "this isn't a movie script. You don't get to rewrite the law because you don't like the outcome." Keanu offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "No rewriting, Your Honor, simply referencing." He turned a page, revealing several printed statutes with highlighted passages and handwritten notes in the margins. "In your earlier statement," Keanu began, glancing briefly up at Calloway, "you cited Municipal Code 17-4B as the basis for your ruling against Hope Haven's continued use of the property." Calloway's jaw clenched, though he tried to hide it. "That's correct." Keanu nodded slowly. "However," he said, his tone neutral, "Municipal Code 17-4B was repealed under the State Amendment of 2022. Its provisions were replaced by Code 18-7C, which explicitly protects nonprofit organizations with active leases under community development initiatives." Silence rippled across the courtroom like a sudden, biting wind. Calloway blinked. His hands, so firm on the bench a moment ago, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at his clerk, his trusted assistant of many years. The clerk hesitated, then gave a slow, reluctant nod. Whispers surged through the courtroom. The defense attorney sitting beside Keanu lowered her head and exhaled quietly, a mixture of relief and astonishment painted on her face. Judge Calloway cleared his throat. Even if that's the case," he said, reaching for another document, "the lease terms remain questionable." Keanu's gaze remained steady. He turned another page in his binder. "Regarding the lease," he said, sliding a copy forward on the table for the clerk to retrieve, "this is the full notarized contract, filed with the County Land Registry. You'll find that Section 5 explicitly grants Hope Haven an option for lease renewal, exercised and recorded on August 4th of last year. That record was filed with the county clerk's office." He pointed to another page. "Here's the stamped confirmation." The clerk took the documents with shaking hands, quickly scanning the top pages before placing them on the bench in front of Calloway. The judge flipped through them with an increasing sense of urgency. "Furthermore," Keanu continued, flipping through his binder with ease, "emails between Westgate Properties and Hope Haven confirm their acceptance of the renewal terms, dated, signed, and timestamped." He handed over printed copies of the correspondence. They bore the electronic signatures of both parties and were attached to receipts of delivery from the county's electronic filing system. Another murmur swept through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Some attendees who had initially come out of curiosity now leaned forward in rapt attention. Judge Calloway's face was tightening, his lips pressed into a thin line. "These documents," he said, voice low and strained, "do not address the issue of back payments on maintenance fees." Keanu nodded, turning to another section in his binder. "On the contrary, Your Honor," he replied smoothly. "Pages 47 through 53 outline all maintenance fees paid to date, including itemized receipts from the last fiscal year. All payments were made according to schedule." He held up the relevant pages, offering them to the clerk. The clerk hesitated, looking to Calloway for direction. Calloway waved a hand impatiently. "Take 'em," he snapped. The clerk obeyed. "Additionally," Keanu went on, now methodically laying out each document as though building an impenetrable wall of evidence, "Hope Haven contracted an independent audit firm, Millstone & Co., to review all expenses, including property upkeep. Their certified audit concludes 0 outstanding balances." He produced the audit's executive summary, with signatures from 3 independent auditors and a notary seal affixed at the bottom of the page. By now the room was no longer murmuring. It was silent, completely silent. Even the faint hum of the overhead fans seemed to pause, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Judge Calloway's hand trembled as he flipped through the papers. He could no longer mask his discomfort. His normally imperious posture had given way to a slump, his shoulders tense. Keanu didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply sat, his hands folded neatly in front of him, patiently waiting. Finally, Judge Calloway cleared his throat again. "Mr. Reeves," he said, voice raspy, "even if your documents are comprehensive, they do not give you the right to grandstand in my courtroom." Keanu's expression didn't change. "I'm not here to grandstand, Your Honor," he said quietly. "I'm here to ensure that the truth is heard. You levied a fine against me for seeking clarification which now appears to have revealed significant procedural errors." More whispers. Now it wasn't just the gallery murmuring. Even the opposing counsel was whispering urgently to his client. "You cited repealed code," Keanu continued. "You dismissed critical evidence as irrelevant, and you imposed an excessive fine without due cause." Calloway's hands clenched the arms of his chair. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his voice softer but somehow more powerful. "I may act in films," he said, "but this isn't a role, it's reality, and in reality, truth matters." The gallery erupted into a wave of quiet awe. Several people reached for their phones, capturing the moment. It wasn't just that Keanu Reeves had stood up for himself. It was the way he did it. Methodically, respectfully, without ever raising his voice. Calloway's breathing was shallow now. His clerk had stopped looking at him entirely, instead focused on double-checking the files Keanu had provided. Keanu sat back once more. His hands rested on the table, his demeanor unshaken. "Your Honor," he said, "may I respectfully request that the fine be reviewed in light of these findings?" Calloway opened his mouth, but no words came out. His jaw worked as he struggled to find some thread of authority to cling to. But it was gone. The courtroom knew it. So did he. Finally, he gave a tight nod. "The court will take the matter under advisement," he said stiffly. Keanu nodded in return. "Thank you, Your Honor." The tension in the room didn't break. If anything, it deepened. But now it had shifted direction. The power dynamics had changed entirely. Where once Judge Calloway had held the room in his iron grip, now it was Keanu Reeves, the quiet man in the black suit, who had turned the tide through calm logic and undeniable truth. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. His knowledge, preparation, and quiet strength had spoken for him, and everyone was listening. The silence that hung over the courtroom after Keanu Reeves' meticulous legal dismantling of Judge Calloway's ruling was heavy and palpable. The spectators, the lawyers, the clerks, even the opposing counsel, all sat motionless, caught in the weight of what they had just witnessed. But Keanu was not finished. He calmly gathered his binder and stood. His movements were deliberate but unhurried, as if each step and gesture had already been considered. He placed the binder in front of him on the table and lifted his gaze to Judge Calloway. "Your Honor," Keanu said quietly, "with respect to the court and in keeping with proper procedure, I would like to formally file a motion to reconsider the fine you levied earlier today." Calloway stared at him, expression tight. "On what grounds, Mr. Reeves?" he asked. His voice, though steady, lacked its earlier authority. Keanu opened his binder once more and carefully laid out several documents. He spoke evenly, the same calm tone he'd used throughout the proceedings. "On the grounds of procedural impropriety, judicial inconsistency, and potential bias," he said, "I believe a formal review is not only warranted, but necessary." He turned a page and tapped his pen lightly on the document. "This is a timeline I've prepared, Your Honor," he continued. "It outlines several recent cases presided over by this court, specifically those involving minor infractions or procedural delays. In each instance, there's a pattern of disproportionately harsh fines levied against younger defendants and individuals representing nonprofits or community initiatives. He handed a copy to the clerk and another to the opposing counsel, maintaining transparency as he moved forward. The data, Keanu explained, is drawn directly from public court records over the past 6 months. Calloway's lips parted as if to object, but Keanu was already turning to the next page. In case 13,427, Keanu went on, a young woman representing a youth literacy program was fined $750 for a late filing, despite evidence that her delay was due to a clerical error in this very court. No such fines were issued to other parties appearing late on that day, including a corporate defendant whose lawyer arrived 15 minutes after the scheduled hearing. Calloway's grip tightened on his gavel, but he did not strike it. The murmurs had started again. People in the gallery leaned toward one another, whispering under their breath. The defense attorney beside Keanu was scribbling notes furiously. In case 13,611, Keanu continued, his voice soft but steady, a community clinic was denied the opportunity to present supplemental documentation. They were told, on the record, that it was too late. Yet the very next case, brought by a property developer, was allowed to submit new evidence during deliberation. The gallery was silent now, not a whisper, just the hum of the lights above and the faint shuffle of papers in Keanu's hands as he turned to the next section. And then, Keanu said, there is case 13,745. He produced another document, a sworn affidavit. This is a signed statement from Samuel Ortega, who appeared in this courtroom last week. Mr. Ortega was fined $2,000 for what was described as a lack of preparation, though he had provided full documentation for his case. He asserts that during the proceedings, he was interrupted more than 20 times and not permitted to explain his defense. He paused, letting that hang in the air before continuing. Mr. Ortega agreed to provide this affidavit voluntarily after learning of today's events. Calloway's hand shifted. He no longer met Keanu's gaze. Your Honor, Keanu said quietly, these examples, and others I have documented, suggest a pattern of conduct that deserves closer examination. There was a shuffling at the back of the courtroom. 2 individuals, dressed plainly, closed their notebooks and exchanged glances. FBI agents pondered. Everyone knew it, though no one spoke it aloud. Their presence had been noted when they arrived earlier that morning, and now they were quietly observing every word, every motion, with surgical precision. Keanu took a breath, steady as ever. This isn't about me, he said, his tone low but resonant. It isn't even about Hope Haven, though they deserve justice. It's about fairness, Your Honor, about the integrity of this courtroom and what happens when the scales of justice are no longer balanced. Calloway's complexion paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but Keanu continued, respectfully but firmly. There's one more thing, Keanu said. He reached for a thin, leather-bound journal tucked inside his binder. It was smaller than the rest of the files, its pages marked with years of notes. He opened it gently, revealing neat handwriting and careful references. This, Keanu said, is a commentary I contributed to anonymously more than a decade ago. It focuses on judicial ethics, the duty of fairness, and the importance of impartiality. I wrote it not as a lawyer, but as a citizen, someone who believes in justice. He cleared his throat softly, then read aloud from one of the entries. A judge robe is not a shield for arrogance, but a mantle of responsibility. To sit in judgment requires humility, patience, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. The room was frozen. Calloway's gavel rested untouched on the bench. Even his bailiff, a stoic man known for his silence, shifted uncomfortably, his expression troubled. Keanu closed the journal gently, setting it back in the binder. I share this, he said quietly, because these aren't new ideas. They are the bedrock of what this institution is meant to stand for. He looked directly at Calloway. I do not wish to disrespect you, Your Honor, but I cannot stand silent when fairness is at stake. The words settled over the room like falling snow, soft, but impossible to ignore. The FBI observers stood, exchanging another glance. One of them scribbled a final note before nodding at the other. Judge Calloway shifted in his chair, his throat working as he tried to gather himself. "Mr. Reeves?" he began, but there was no strength behind his voice now. Keanu remained standing, calm and resolute. "I formally request a judicial review," he said, "of this case and any other case in which disproportionate fines or decisions may have been made." Calloway exhaled slowly, heavily. The authority he'd once wielded with such casual confidence was slipping through his fingers. He glanced around the room, where every eye was fixed on him. His clerk, once eager to follow his orders, sat still, staring down at her hands. His bailiff no longer looked to him for direction. Keanu watched all of it, quiet but purposeful. "This court," Keanu said, "belongs to the people, not the powerful, and certainly not to me, but to all of us. It deserves better." A long pause. Then, Judge Calloway gave a reluctant nod. "Motion to reconsider is granted," he said. His voice was hoarse. "This hearing is adjourned until further notice." The gavel came down, but there was no thunder in it, just a dull, hollow sound. Keanu gave a respectful nod and closed his binder, gathering his papers with steady hands. Reporters scribbled notes feverishly. Cameras flashed as the gallery slowly emptied, many of those present lingering as if reluctant to leave the place where something remarkable had just happened. The FBI agents moved toward the bench, quietly requesting a word with Judge Calloway in private. As Keanu stepped away from the table, Fiona Carrington met him near the doorway. She'd been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, her expression one of deep pride. "You handled that with grace," she said softly. Keanu offered a faint smile. "It wasn't about handling," he replied. "It was about truth." The two walked out of the courtroom together, passing through the wooden doors into the bright, late afternoon light. Inside, the weight of Keanu's quiet strength remained, a presence stronger than any shouted argument or dramatic gesture could ever have been. And the courtroom, once ruled by a heavy hand, was now the beginning of something else entirely. The tension inside courtroom 3 was almost unbearable. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen but undeniable. Judge Arthur Calloway sat motionless on his bench, the muscles in his jaw tight, his knuckles white around the handle of his gavel. It was supposed to be a simple case, a minor dispute over a lease, but it had turned into something far more dangerous. Dangerous for him. Keanu Reeves stood near his table, his binder now closed, his documents stacked with meticulous care. His hands rested on top of them, fingers interlaced, his body perfectly still. Yet there was an undeniable power emanating from him, not the kind of power born from fame or wealth or notoriety, but the quiet, unstoppable force of truth. A man who had nothing to gain and nothing to lose, but everything to stand for. Judge Calloway cleared his throat and reached for the gavel once again. "This court," he announced, though his voice cracked ever so slightly, "is now in recess." But before he could bring the gavel down, there was movement at the back of the courtroom. Two men stood up from the benches reserved for public observers. Both wore dark suits and bore the measured, composed demeanor of men used to operating in high-stakes situations. As they advanced toward the front of the room, one of them reached into his jacket. The entire courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. Keanu didn't move. He simply watched. The first agent produced a folded document, holding it aloft as he and his partner approached the bench. "Judge Arthur Calloway," the agent said, his voice steady but loud enough to carry through the hushed room. "We are serving you with a notice of investigation for judicial misconduct, bribery, and obstruction of justice. You are advised to step down from the bench immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the room. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked away, leaving only disbelief and awe in its place. Judge Calloway blinked at them, his mouth opening, then closing, as if the words had suddenly abandoned him. Then he found his voice, sharp and brittle. "This is an ambush," he barked. "A conspiracy. You have no authority to—" "We do, sir," the second agent interrupted smoothly. "You are under federal investigation. This is not a request." Calloway's gaze darted wildly, first to his clerk, who refused to look up from her trembling hands, then to his bailiff, whose jaw was clenched but who stood frozen. Finally, his eyes locked on Keanu Reeves. And there it was, the glare of a man who had spent decades believing he was untouchable, now faced with the terrifying realization that his power was slipping away. His stare was full of venom, but also fear. Keanu didn't react. His expression was unreadable, his hand still resting on the binder that had exposed so much. But his silence wasn't weakness. It was control. Calloway pushed back from the bench with a sudden jerk of his chair. "I won't be humiliated like this," he shouted. "You think you can do this to me because of him?" He stabbed a shaking finger in Keanu's direction. "An actor? A pretender?" Keanu slowly stood, smoothing the lapels of his plain black suit. He took a step forward, then another. But he didn't approach the agents or the judge. Instead, he turned to face the room. The gallery was packed, people crammed together on wooden benches, holding their breath. Some had phones in their hands, recording every second. Others just sat frozen, eyes wide. And then Keanu spoke. "This isn't about me," he said quietly. His voice was low but carried easily, the room now so silent that his words seemed to fill every corner. "This was never about revenge, or spectacle, or power. It's about doing what's right." He turned slightly, glancing at Calloway, but without animosity, just resolve. "For everyone who has ever believed in second chances," he continued. "For those who have been silenced, dismissed, or ignored in this courtroom, and in others like it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. Someone sniffled softly. Another person began to clap, slowly at first. Then others joined. The sound swelled, filling the chamber. Not in triumph, but in solidarity. Calloway's face darkened. "This is a circus," he hissed. "I'm still a sitting judge." The agent nearest him stepped closer. "Not anymore," he said simply. "Please stand and come with us." The bailiff finally moved, but instead of aiding the judge, he stepped back. His expression was pained, but resolute. His silence was an answer in itself. With shaking hands, Calloway stood, his polished shoes scuffing the old hardwood floor. The agents moved to flank him as one produced a set of handcuffs. They clicked shut around his wrists with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. Gasps, whispers, and then applause again. Some people cried openly. Others sat stunned, their faces pale but their eyes shining with something that looked like hope. As Calloway was led from the bench, he turned his head for one last look at Keanu Reeves. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. Keanu bowed his head respectfully, not in gloating, but in quiet recognition that a long overdue reckoning had finally come. The reporters surged forward as Calloway was escorted out. Flashes from cameras lit up the walls. Microphones were thrust forward as questions flew like arrows. "Is it true you took bribes from developers? What about the fines against youth organizations? Judge Calloway, do you have anything to say to the people you sentenced unfairly?" But Calloway's head stayed down, his once pristine robe now wrinkled and stained with the sweat of fear. The gavel he'd used as a weapon for so long sat forgotten on the bench behind him. Keanu turned back to the room, stepping away from his table to stand in front of the bench. He took a moment before speaking again. "This wasn't about one case," he said. "It wasn't even about one judge." His gaze swept the faces of those watching. "It was about the principle that no one is above the law, and that dignity belongs to everyone who stands before it." The applause returned, louder this time, but still full of reverence rather than celebration. Keanu picked up his binder and walked toward the door. As he passed the reporters, some of them called out to him, "Mr. Reeves, are you going to speak out further? Will you pursue more legal actions? What made you take this stand?" He paused at the doorway, looking back over his shoulder. "Sometimes," he said, "the right thing is the quiet thing. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand up. With that, he stepped into the bright hallway. Fiona Carrington was waiting for him just outside, her arms crossed but her eyes soft with respect. "You did it," she said. "No," Keanu replied. "We all did." She nodded, understanding. "The foundation will be proud," she said. "And the kids at Hope Haven? This will give them hope." Keanu gave a small smile. "That's the point." Behind them, the courtroom continued to buzz. Reporters filed their stories, spectators called their families, phones lit up with breaking news alerts. Judge Calloway, arrested for judicial misconduct after stunning courtroom. Turned by Keanu Reeves. Justice finally served in small-town court. As Keanu and Fiona walked down the marble hallway toward the exit, people parted to let them pass. Some clapped him on the shoulder. Others simply nodded, eyes shining. Outside, the evening air was cool. A soft breeze moved through the courtyard, carrying with it the faintest sound of cheers from the crowd gathering beyond the courthouse doors. Keanu took one last look at the building behind him. "Not about winning," he murmured. "Just about doing what's right." Fiona smiled as they headed toward his motorcycle parked at the curb. And sometimes doing what's right changes everything. The two rode away, the golden light of sunset trailing behind them like a quiet promise. The courtroom had barely emptied before the headlines took over the world. Keanu Reeves exposes corrupt judge live in court. Hollywood actor turns legal genius. Judge Calloway in handcuffs. Justice served. Keanu's quiet battle sparks a movement. It was everywhere. Within hours, news outlets from Los Angeles to London were scrambling to cover the extraordinary events at the small municipal courthouse in California. What had begun as a simple land lease dispute over a youth shelter had turned into an international spectacle, led by one of the most respected and quietly admired men in Hollywood, Keanu Reeves. But while the world's attention fixated on the spectacle, Keanu had quietly disappeared from the public eye. The Hope Haven youth shelter, the very heart of the dispute that had drawn Keanu into the courtroom, was flooded with attention too, but of a different kind. Donations poured in from around the world. An anonymous donor pledged $500,000 within the first day. Soon after, a group of small business owners from across the state banded together to raise another $250,000. Parents, former troubled teens, and supporters from all walks of life sent in letters of gratitude, support, and checks. Some as small as $5, others in the thousands. What had once been a struggling program to provide housing, education, and mentorship to at-risk youth was suddenly flourishing. The director of Hope Haven, a middle-aged woman named Clara Ruiz, stood on the front steps of the shelter, holding a handwritten letter. "This is from Keanu," she explained, wiping tears from her eyes. She read aloud, "This was never about me. This was about hope. Hope for these kids, hope for second chances, and hope that we can all be better, keep going." Keanu. Judge Arthur Calloway wasn't just arrested. He was indicted within days. The charges were severe: corruption, bias, judicial misconduct, and abuse of power. Investigators revealed years of rulings favoring wealthy landowners and corporate interests over nonprofits and struggling individuals. He had fined people into bankruptcy and buried evidence that could have exonerated them. Public records showed a clear pattern. He had disproportionately targeted organizations like Hope Haven, often bending laws to favor those with money and influence. The local bar association issued a formal apology to the community. Meanwhile, protesters stood outside the courthouse for days, holding signs that read, "No one is above the law," and "Thank you, Keanu." Calloway's resignation came swiftly, but it wasn't enough. By the end of the month, the disgraced judge faced trial for his actions. His former bailiff, court clerk, and even his secretary testified against him. Justice was being served. Amidst the media frenzy, Keanu did something no one expected. He turned down every interview, every TV appearance, every award offer. When a major network offered him a primetime special, Keanu sent a simple reply: "I'm not the story, justice is." Instead, Keanu went home, not to the Hollywood Hills or some distant retreat, but to his small house in the valley. And he worked quietly. From that small home office, Keanu drafted the founding documents for something new: the Silent Justice Project. The Silent Justice Project was a nonprofit initiative aimed at providing legal defense resources to community nonprofits. Keanu had witnessed firsthand how many organizations, like Hope Haven, were left vulnerable simply because they couldn't afford a legal team to fight back against corrupt systems. Keanu believed no one should have to stand alone. He made the first donation himself, $1 million. But he wasn't alone for long. Enter Fiona Carrington. For viewers unfamiliar with Keanu, she was first introduced in video 142 on this channel. In that story, she stood beside Keanu when he was publicly mocked by a liberal journalist, and later helped him expose deep corruption in the media industry. A sharp-witted journalist turned activist, Fiona was known for her integrity and fearless pursuit of truth. When Fiona heard about Keanu's new project, she reached out immediately. "I'm in," she said simply. She became the co-director of the Silent Justice Project, bringing with her a network of attorneys, journalists, and investigators committed to defending the voiceless. Despite mounting pressure from media outlets to speak publicly, Keanu issued only one statement through his team: "I'm just a man doing what I can. We all have a role to play. I just found mine." It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was Keanu, and it resonated deeply. Social media flooded with tributes and messages of support. Hashtags like Silent Justice and Keanu's Quiet Fight trended worldwide. One young woman, a former Hope Haven resident, posted a video that went viral. "It changed my life years ago, and now he's changing the system. Thank you, Keanu." The Silent Justice Project quickly grew beyond anyone's expectation. Within weeks, lawyers across the country volunteered their time to review questionable rulings in small courts. Paralegals offered free document preparation for nonprofits. Law schools invited Keanu and Fiona to speak to their ethics classes, although Keanu politely declined most offers, sending Fiona in his place. "Let the work speak louder than we do," Keanu said. What started as a fight for one youth shelter expanded into a national conversation about fairness, bias, and accountability in local courts. Other judges were quietly investigated. 2 resigned. In New York, a community center was spared foreclosure because of evidence uncovered by the Silent Justice Project's legal team. In Ohio, a wrongly accused nonprofit director had charges dropped after Keanu's team stepped in. Though Keanu remained behind the scenes, stories about his quiet heroism continued to emerge. A photo circulated of him sitting cross-legged on the floor of his office, papers spread around him, reading legal briefs late into the night. Another showed him at a community center in Los Angeles, serving lunch to teens who had no idea they were being fed by a movie star. When asked why he refused to take credit for what was happening, Fiona shared his words: "This isn't about making noise, it's about making things right." The world watched as Keanu Reeves, an actor known for his humility and grace, transformed into something more. A quiet force for justice. A man who didn't raise his voice but made sure others were heard. Someone who believed in second chances, not just for the youth at Hope Haven, but for the system itself. And as the Silent Justice Project continued its work, one thing became clear. Keanu's legacy wasn't just on film. It was in every life he touched, every injustice he quietly fought, and every second chance he helped create. The headlines slowly faded from the front pages, but what Keanu Reeves had done that day in court didn't just vanish. If anything, it grew, quietly, relentlessly, like ripples expanding across a still lake after a single stone breaks the surface. The moment Keanu exposed Judge Calloway's corruption wasn't the climax. It was just the beginning of a movement no one saw coming. It started within days. The California Judicial Conduct Review Board announced a sweeping investigation into lower court judges across the state. What they found sent shockwaves through the legal system. Records showed patterns of bias similar to Calloway's, fines that disproportionately impacted nonprofits, rulings that favored corporate interests, dismissals of evidence that should have been reviewed in the pursuit of justice. By the end of the month, 3 more judges were suspended pending formal charges. 2 weeks later, a 5th resigned quietly, avoiding media scrutiny but not escaping public notice. When asked what triggered the sudden statewide investigations, a spokesperson gave a measured answer. "We were given reason to re-examine fairness in our courts. We intend to restore the public's faith in justice." But everyone knew the real reason: Keanu Reeves. Los Angeles was the first. A mural appeared overnight on the corner of Melrose and Fairfax. It was simple, powerful. A silhouette of Keanu Reeves in a black suit, standing tall and calm, a binder in his hands. Above his head, 3 simple words: "Silent Justice." The artist remained anonymous, but within days more murals followed. One in Brooklyn depicted Keanu seated at a courtroom desk, calm and composed, a halo of light behind his head as papers and documents seemed to float around him. Another popped up in Chicago, Keanu standing at a podium, delivering what looked like a quiet but unshakable truth. In each piece, the emphasis wasn't on his fame or his movies. It was his presence, his humility, and the silent courage that had become the hallmark of his life. Fans began posting photos on social media, standing in front of the murals with the caption, "Justice doesn't need to shout." Soon, the hashtag Silent Justice trended worldwide. The film was called The Actor Who Defended Justice. At first, Keanu wanted no part in it. But Fiona Carrington, the journalist turned activist who had partnered with Keanu in the Silent Justice Project, gently persuaded him. "This isn't about you," she said. "It's about the people you've inspired to stand up for themselves." So he agreed to one interview. 1 hour, filmed in a quiet room, no makeup, no lights, no script. Keanu sat at a simple table and spoke softly about why he stood up in court that day. Hope Haven wasn't just a building, he said. It was a promise to kids who didn't have one. If we don't protect places like that, who are we? The documentary followed not just Keanu's role, but the larger movement that unfolded after Judge Calloway's arrest. It profiled families saved by the Silent Justice Project's work, young lawyers who joined the fight, and community leaders inspired to run for public office after seeing change was possible. When it premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, The Actor Who Defended Justice received a 12-minute standing ovation. By the time it hit streaming services, it became a global phenomenon, translated into 42 languages. Within its first month, 100 million people had watched it. A simple scene from the film, Keanu riding his motorcycle alone down the Pacific Coast Highway after a long day of teaching, became iconic. Quiet, reflective, proof that change didn't need to be loud to be powerful. Keanu refused offers from major universities. He turned down speaking engagements at law schools and conferences that wanted him to headline their events. But he did agree to give lectures, on one condition. No publicity, no press, just conversations. He visited community centers in low-income neighborhoods across California. In small windowless rooms, he sat with young people and talked about ethics, integrity, and justice. He explained the basics of law, not as a lawyer, but as someone who cared enough to learn how the system worked. In one community center in East LA, he sat on a folding chair in front of 20 young men and women who had grown up believing the system was rigged against them. "I can't promise you the system is perfect," he told them, "but I can show you how to stand up inside it, quietly, firmly, and in a way that makes people listen." Word spread. Soon his classes filled up months in advance. And every time someone asked why he did it, Keanu just smiled faintly and said, "Because someone has to." Keanu Reeves had always been known for his humility, but after the Calloway case, his quiet courage became a symbol of integrity in places no one expected. Corporate boards referenced his story when rewriting ethics guidelines. Legal conferences used his courtroom strategy as a case study on citizen activism. Even government agencies discussed his role in sparking judicial reform across multiple states. He was named Time's Person of the Year, although he refused to appear on the cover. "Let the work speak," he said. In New York, a newly elected congresswoman cited Keanu's Silent Justice Project as the reason she ran for office. "He reminded me," she said in an interview, "that quiet courage is still courage, and that integrity doesn't come from a title. It comes from what you're willing to stand up for when no one's watching." The Silent Justice Project, which had started in Keanu's small home office, was now a national organization. It had offices in 6 states. It had provided legal assistance to over 300 nonprofits. And it had successfully overturned 42 unjust rulings in cases involving youth centers, shelters, and community programs. Fiona Carrington, who now ran the day-to-day operations, described Keanu's leadership this way: "He's not the loudest voice in the room, but when he speaks, everyone listens, because they know he only speaks when it matters." And it wasn't just the legal world taking notice. Social workers, teachers, and young activists carried Keanu's story into their work, using it as an example of how one person's quiet stand could shift the ground beneath their feet. It was an early autumn morning when Keanu rode his motorcycle out to the site of a new youth shelter being built in his name. He didn't want it named after him, but the community insisted. The Keanu Reeves Center for Youth Empowerment would offer housing, education, and legal advocacy for at-risk teens. He stood quietly at the construction site, watching as workers laid the foundation. He didn't say much, he just nodded. But to those who knew him, it was clear what he was thinking. This wasn't about him. It was about what came after him. Years later, when asked in an interview about why he chose to stand up in that small courtroom so long ago, Keanu gave a simple answer: because no one else did. And that was the truth. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about power. It was about doing what was right, quietly, and without expecting applause. Keanu Reeves, the actor known for roles as heroes on screen, had become something greater. A real-life symbol of silent strength. A quiet man who started a movement, and the world would never forget it. Years passed quietly, the same way Keanu Reeves had always preferred. After everything, the courtroom battles, the headlines, the murals, the documentary, he slipped back into the kind of life he'd always valued: simple, unassuming, private. But the world hadn't forgotten him, and the movement he quietly started kept growing, far beyond anything he could have imagined. Keanu eventually left Los Angeles behind. He found peace in the small coastal towns of Oregon, where the air was cool and the pace was slower. It was here, tucked between towering evergreens and quiet, misty mornings, that Keanu discovered a new calling. He began teaching at a community college on the Oregon coast. Not acting, not film, but philosophy and ethics. He'd studied both quietly for years, fascinated by the ideas of moral responsibility, integrity, and justice. Now, in a small classroom overlooking the Pacific Ocean, he shared those ideas with young minds eager to understand the world beyond themselves. Most of his students didn't care that he was famous. To them, he was just Professor Reeves. He rode his motorcycle to class every morning, wearing the same black boots and leather jacket he'd worn for years. His lectures were thoughtful and soft-spoken. His assignments focused less on grades and more on reflection. "Think about what you believe," he often said, "and why you believe it." He never imposed his ideas on anyone. He just asked questions and waited quietly for answers. And in that small, sunlit classroom, Keanu Reeves was exactly where he belonged. Fiona Carrington, now a respected journalist and founder of the Silent Justice Project, had spent years encouraging Keanu to let her tell his story. For a long time, he refused. But after much consideration and perhaps a little persuasion, he agreed. The result was a book that became a national bestseller. It was titled Silent Strength: The Keanu Reeves Story. Fiona didn't write it as a biography of a Hollywood star. She wrote it as a testament to what quiet courage could accomplish. She told the story of the day Keanu walked into Judge Calloway's courtroom not as a celebrity, but as a man defending what was right. The book chronicled his journey from actor to advocate, the legal reforms his actions had inspired, and the countless nonprofits his silent justice project had helped. It wasn't just a story about one man. It was a blueprint for anyone who believed they were too small to make a difference. The book became required reading at law schools, ethics seminars, and leadership workshops around the world. And yet Keanu never read it himself. "I lived it," he said with a small smile. "That's enough." Keanu never gave up writing. His motorcycle, an old black arch he'd helped design years before, was his sanctuary. Whenever the weight of the world grew heavy, he would slip on his helmet and ride. Along the Pacific Coast Highway, where cliffs met endless sky. Through winding mountain roads, where sunlight filtered through tall trees. Locals often spotted him at sunset, riding north with the wind at his back. No cameras, no security, just a man and his machine, seeking the kind of freedom that couldn't be found anywhere else. On some days, he would stop at a favorite overlook, one that few tourists knew about. He would sit quietly on a bench, helmet resting beside him, watching the waves crash far below. Sometimes, he'd bring a journal and scribble down thoughts that came to him. Other times, he just sat in silence, breathing in the salt air and letting the world slow down. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need applause. This was his peace. And for Keanu Reeves, that was the greatest reward of all. Even though he'd stepped away from public life, Keanu's influence never faded. The Silent Justice Project expanded internationally, opening offices in Europe and South America. Young lawyers around the world cited him as their inspiration to practice law with empathy and integrity. In Los Angeles, the Hope Haven Youth Shelter, once on the brink of collapse, thrived. They opened 3 more centers in Keanu's name, offering housing, education, and legal advocacy for at-risk teens. A plaque at the entrance of the first shelter read simply, "For those who deserve a second chance." Murals still appeared from time to time, in unexpected places: a subway wall in Tokyo, a school in Brazil, a library in Johannesburg. Always the same image, Keanu's silhouette, standing calmly, often with the words, "Silent Justice." And yet Keanu never commented on them, never sought them out. He just kept teaching, and writing, and living quietly. One evening as summer slipped into fall, Keanu took his motorcycle up the coast for a long ride. The sun hung low in the sky, casting everything in a golden glow. The ocean shimmered like molten gold, waves rolling in slow and steady. He reached his favorite overlook and stopped the bike. The engine's rumble, fading into the gentle sounds of wind and sea. Keanu took off his helmet, resting it on the seat. He walked slowly to the edge of the cliff and stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, watching the horizon. For a long time, he said nothing. There was no one else around, no one to hear him if he did speak. But he smiled faintly, a smile that held years of reflection, a smile that knew he had done what mattered, and that the world was, in some small way, better for it. The sky blazed orange and pink as the sun dipped below the waterline. Keanu stood there until the light faded, his silhouette still and steady against the endless expanse. And in that moment, he wasn't Keanu Reeves the actor, or Keanu Reeves the activist. He was simply a man who had chosen, long ago, to stand up when it counted. As night settled over the coast, Keanu turned back to his bike. He slipped on his helmet, started the engine, and rode off into the dark. Somewhere, miles away, people were still telling his story. They were still reading Fiona's book, still learning about the Silent Justice Project, still painting murals and naming scholarships in his honor. But Keanu Reeves didn't need any of it. He knew the truth. Legacies aren't built on fame. They're built on what you do when no one's watching. And his legacy? It was silent, it was steady, and it was everything the world needed. In a world that often confused noise with strength, Keanu Reeves reminded us of something far more powerful. That true courage doesn't shout. It doesn't seek attention. It doesn't need an audience. It moves quietly. It acts when no one is looking. And it stands firm when no one expects it. Keanu didn't walk into that courtroom seeking revenge. He didn't raise his voice or slam his fist on a desk. He didn't humiliate Judge Calloway with insults or rage. Instead, he did what few have the patience or the strength to do. He stayed calm. He stood on truth. And he let integrity speak louder than anything else in the room. In the end, it wasn't the fine, the courtroom bias, or even the corruption that mattered most. It was how Keanu responded to injustice. Not with anger, but with quiet courage. There's a lesson in Keanu's story for all of us. It's easy to think the world rewards the loudest voices, that to fight injustice you need to be aggressive or combative. But Keanu showed us something different, something better. Real strength is quiet. It's in the person who stands their ground with dignity, no matter who's watching. It's in the one who stays respectful, even when they're being disrespected. It's in those who don't need applause or recognition to do the right thing. And sometimes, it's in someone who could have walked away but chose not to. Because doing what's right, especially when it's hard, matters. Keanu Reeves had nothing to prove when he defended the youth shelter. He didn't need to risk his reputation by standing up to a corrupt judge. But he did it anyway, because he believed in fairness, in second chances, and in justice for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And that's what makes his story so powerful. Not because he's a celebrity, but because he's a man who lives by a principle that's easy to say and so difficult to live by. Do the right thing, even when no one's watching, especially then. Now, I want you to take a moment and think about your own life. Have you ever seen someone stand up quietly for what's right? Or maybe you've been that person. It could be a friend who stood by you when things got tough, a teacher who defended a student who no one else believed in. Or maybe it was you, doing something you knew was right, even though it cost you something. These are the moments that define us, not the times we win awards or receive praise, but the times we stand alone and refuse to back down. If Keanu's story inspired you today, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever seen quiet courage like his? Maybe it was a moment in your life or someone close to you who showed the same kind of silent strength. Tell us about it in the comments. Your story might be the encouragement someone else needs today. You never know who's reading or who needs hope. And if you're watching this right now thinking, I wish I could be that strong, you already are. Because strength isn't something we're given. It's a choice. And every day we have the chance to choose courage over fear, integrity over convenience, truth over silence. If you believe integrity matters, if you believe that doing the right thing is worth it, even when it's hard, then I want to invite you to take one simple action today. Like this video, share Keanu's incredible story with someone who needs hope. And subscribe to this channel for more inspiring moments just like this. Every time you like, share, or comment, you help this message reach someone who needs it. Someone who might feel alone. Someone who's fighting their own battle and needs to be reminded. Quiet courage wins. You can be part of that ripple effect, just like Keanu was. Just like Fiona Carrington, who stood by him and helped launch the Silent Justice Project. Just like the countless people who joined a movement they never expected to be part of, until one man stood up and showed them how. We live in noisy times. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone wants to be heard. But there's something rare and incredibly powerful about someone who acts with quiet conviction. No drama, no spotlight, just steady, honest action. Keanu's story reminds us that one person can make a difference. And it doesn't take shouting to do it. It takes strength, integrity, and a willingness to stand alone if you have to. But here's the truth. You're never really alone when you're doing the right thing. There's a whole world of people who believe in the same things. Sometimes they're just waiting for someone else to take the first step. Keanu did. And look what happened. At the end of the day, it's not about headlines, or fame, or applause. It's about what you do when no one expects you to stand tall. It's about leaving something behind that matters. Keanu's quiet legacy wasn't just in exposing a corrupt judge. It was in inspiring others to act with integrity, to fight for fairness, to believe that one small voice, spoken with courage, can change everything. And you can be part of that legacy too. Like this video if Keanu's story moved you. Share it with someone who needs hope today. And subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. True stories of integrity, justice, and quiet courage that change the world. You matter. Your voice matters. And together, we can make a difference. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.